and I wasn't looking for one in particular. I don't know what the answer is. We should ask the people that have left. But I suspect, so a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I'm originally from St. John. Then I moved to the East Coast for a couple of years, and then I came back. Throughout my entire service career, I've served college. This is kind of what I've seen over the last 20 years of my serving college. Is it right? I don't know, but this is just what I see, okay? I believe the number one reason, so the reasons that people stay in the church, we said if the faith was practiced at home, if they had somebody who was outside of their family connected to the faith, and the last thing was if people had an experience that brought them closer to God, that kept them in the faith. Okay. I believe, and I might be wrong, I'm not usually wrong, but I might be wrong. I believe that that's the biggest thing, is the experience with God, the encounter with God. I believe that that is what's missing. And from there comes everything else. And so that's kind of where I want to start. And when I say you guys, I'm going to be saying you guys a lot, and that's the collective you, right? Because you guys are here and you're present in church, so obviously you're not the problem. Or you might be, I don't know. But I'm not talking at you specifically directly. I'm talking like the collective you very generally. Because I do believe that this is something that we should take and give to our youth, right? Because the idea is that we're trying to learn something here so that the next generation doesn't disappear. Does that make sense? Right? And so that we stick around, right? So, a lack of an encounter or a lack of an experience with God. To me, that comes from a lack of cultivating a relationship with God, okay? From there, you have not serving. So I think the big two things here are missing an experience with God and not serving, okay? And I'm going to get into them in a little bit more detail. But I want to know the idea of having a spiritual experience with God. Many of us grew up in the church and we take our church for granted because you could have been born Muslim and then you wouldn't have known about Christ. I'm so sick and tired of hearing that, right? I don't take my faith for granted as much as I completely and totally disregard God and God's grace, right? It's not about my faith, it's about my relationship with God. And that is what I am continually disregarding every single day. And I would venture to say that most of us are doing the same, right? So if we're talking about an experience with God, and that's what keeps people in the church, what does that mean? When I say an experience or an encounter with God, what does that mean? Again, I've got my Shay, so I'm
Like you feel like you had a prayer answered?
Feel like you had a prayer Jonathan, honestly, guys, he's really blowing you out of the water today. Okay, so you feel like you had a prayer answered by God. That could be an experience. What else? What else is an encounter and experience with God? Corey, your hand below. What does it look like? Because if I don't know what an experience with God means, if I don't know what an encounter with God means, how am I, A, ever supposed to find it? How am I supposed to seek it? How am I supposed to know when it happens? And then how am I supposed to talk about it? So is anybody here looking to meet God? Just me? No, okay, thank you. What's up? Meet.
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm just looking to meet God. Get out of here. So is anybody in here looking to have an experience with God?
Yes.
Or a continual experience.
If you will.
Right.
Thank you. Okay, so what are you looking for? What are you seeking? How will you know when it's happened?
You feel at peace?
You feel at peace? What's your name?
Mary.
Miriam, thank you. Tomorrow. What else?
So something that I think I've realized even in my own life throughout, the journey in the church is that maybe a lack of understanding of the depth of the sacraments will kind of cause that, feeling of not having an encounter with God, not understanding the depth of the sacraments. So just one thought.
And what's your name?
Right.
One
You
more-
call me Ed.
Thank you. Wait, is it Ra'ed?
It's right. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, all right. No, that's 100%. Let me ask you another question. Since nobody seems to be looking for God, let me ask you another question. Is being disconnected from the church the same as being disconnected from God and the faith? It's not. How so?
Because you could be in church all day, every day, in various ways, and not maintain a relationship with God.
So
It's like almost self-serving, as opposed to God serving. That you're in church.
right, but if I'm separated from the church, by proxy I'm separated from God? Or you're saying that I can be separated from the church, but I could still have a relationship with God?
I don't think the there should be a correlation, but the correlation's not necessarily there, is what I'm saying. Like, certain people can be at church all day long, attend every liturgy, attend every day,
But not have a relationship with God.
but not have God.
I'm asking the opposite question. If I'm far from church, does that necessarily mean that I'm far from God? No, of course it does. Of course it does. For all of the reasons I just said. Because we are only connected to God through what? Give me something, God. What? Through the sacraments, right? Right, right? The sacraments, right? Because where else am I getting the body and blood of Christ? Nowhere, I hope. I hope that's a much bigger issue, okay? Because we're connected to Christ through the sacraments, right? Through the Eucharist, through all of the sacraments, through fellowship, right? And through the Word of God, right? So this all, because I hear all the time, again, I've been serving college youth for 20 years, just because I'm far from church doesn't mean that I'm far from God. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. And I'm here to tell you that if you are trying to convince yourself of otherwise, just don't bother, because you might be able to convince yourself all day long, but that's not the truth, okay? That is not the truth. You cannot be distant from the church, but still really connected with God. It does not work. It doesn't work, and that's the reason that the church is here, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? I'm not really concerned with whether or not you agree, just because it doesn't matter when we're, I mean, and that's not because I don't care, but that's because truth is not relative, right? So when we're talking about truth, it doesn't matter if you agree. There's no such thing, you guys are here all the time, my truth, you live your truth, I'll live my truth. There's no such thing as your truth and my truth. There's one truth, and whether you choose to agree with it or not doesn't change it, okay? So the fact is that we cannot be separated from the church, but still one with God. And again, you can wrestle with that all you want, and you're like, girl, Candace doesn't know anything. You can say whatever you want, but that's a fact, okay? And for exactly what the reasons that Rod said, because the sacraments are critical, and that is how we are connected to the body of Christ, okay? So going back again, right? If you're looking for an experience with God, what are you seeking out? How will you know? How will you know that you have found it? Nobody else has any. So then what are we doing? We don't, like, what are we doing if we don't know what we're looking for? Why are we here every week? I hope you guys are here every week, but I don't know. So what are we doing if we don't know what we're looking for? I probably should have said at the very, I am a very direct person, and I apologize if that's offensive. I just we just do not, I mean, I am still emotionally devastated over Kobe's death. So if anything, we should learn that we do not have time. We don't have time to lollygag and to just, to just kind of dance around and figure things out, and I'll figure it out when I'm older. You might not be older, and this is not like a scare tactic. It is a fact of life. So I'm a very direct person just because, it's who I am. So what I want to know now is if we don't know what we're looking for, then what are we doing? Why are we here? Does anybody have it? Do you have an answer, Mina? Anybody? I'll take.
Your question was what it's like having an experience with God or like an encounter, right?
Yeah.
I would say.
How would you know when you've had it?
Just being at church. It's like a very simple answer, but like all of us being here, it's kind of like having an experience with God, because if I was at home, I mean, I can feel God still, but being here around like others that feel the same way, I think I feel more connected and having that experience with God.
Okay, so for you it's a feeling, you would say.
It's a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Okay.
You know.
If you were just looking for a sense to feel like really sure about what you're doing, because you're not depending on yourself, you're depending on God, you're praying about it, and the more you do it, I feel like the more you're going to find that comfort, and that you're going to find out that, or you're going to feel like comfortable doing whatever it is that you're doing.
So for you it's comfort.
Sure.
That's kind of like ultimately you're.
Comfort and like confidence, and just knowing that like I'm living my life the right way, I'm doing whatever I'm doing, it's like it's what I'm supposed to be doing.
Okay, thank you. What else? So Maria said it's a feeling for her. She feels more connected. For Jonathan, it's a feeling of comfort and confidence that he's doing the right thing. Any other, when you've had an encounter with God, anybody else know what that's going to look like, or what are you looking for? How will you know it's happened? Because all of this is to say, Because again, I believe that my main reason for why people fall away from the church is because they have not had this real experience with God, right? That is my belief. Because I'll talk about that later, but if I believe that people are falling away from the church because they have not had a true encounter with God, right? Then I need to be able to tell people, this is what's going to happen when it happens. This is what's going to happen when you've encountered God and you've had a real relationship with God and you know him and he knows you and you love him and he loves you. This is what's going to happen. And if we can't say that, if we can't identify what it's going to look like, how are we ever going to know how to find it?
Candace, what were the three things again? The encounter with God, experience with God, what?
What I believe keeps people away from it is an encounter with God, which comes from like a relationship, right? But the second thing is service.
Service.
A lack of service is what pushes people away, and I'm going to get to that.
Also, I think a lot of people, like there's this one guy who talks about apologetics and stuff. He says a lot of times young adults get talked out of their relationship with God and their Christianity is because they were never talked into it to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So part of it lacks our, like as servants and as a church and as a community, to really bring forth like, not just education like in its like blind way, but it's like the experience of like having a relationship with God with people, like, like we miss that sometimes.
Yeah, we definitely do.
Like we talk a big talk, but like there's no like sometimes like there's like we miss the mark, you know.
Agreed. And none of this is to say that any of this is your fault. I mean, some of it's part of it's our fault. But what I'm looking for, and there is no right answer. I don't know. Everybody's different, right? Every time I ask a question, I don't have a right answer. I just want to know what you guys think. So let's just, as far as an encounter with God, right? For me, when will I know that I've had an encounter with God? When it produces action. Right? When you've had an experience with God, when you've had an encounter with God, you are moved to do something. So anybody who tells me that they've experienced God, that they know God, that they've had an encounter with God, and they don't move on it, I don't know how much I buy into that. Okay? So does anybody, this is like a good example, it's a very intense example, but it's a good example. So you guys are all familiar with Mother Teresa, right? Right? No. Have any of you read her books, any of her books? Not Come Across and Help Us. There's a book she has of all of her letters. Did anybody read that book?
I saw the movie. Was it true to the book? Or?
I don't know. I didn't see the movie. I read the book. But,
The movie was great.
so I'll tell you what it was. So this book was about Mother Teresa. We all know Mother Teresa. She served in like the poorest of the poor in India, right? It was just a mess, right? And she served there for like, I don't know, 50 years or something like that, right? And she speaks about why she did that, and she said that she was in Calcutta and she was getting on a train and she saw a man who was just so poor. He had sores all over his body. He couldn't even like get off the train, and like he was just a mess, like couldn't even move, just like super frail, in terrible condition. And she said in that split moment, I think she was like 23 years old, 24 years old. She said in that split second, she said she saw Christ in that man. Okay, she saw Christ in that man, and she was so compelled to devote her entire life, her entire service to like serving the poorest of the poor. Okay? I know, you're all looking at me, I'm not Mother Teresa, I'm not either, okay? But what I'm going to tell you, the next piece of it is this. This book of hers was a book of letters that she wrote to the Archbishop at the time, talking every single day. I mean, she wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters about how she did not feel the presence of Christ, about how she did not feel like God was with her, how she felt like a dark cloud over her, that people were suffering, and she just did not feel the presence of Christ, right? Now, the deeper thing of this is that people say, like, when you're really close to, the high priest and stuff say when you're really close to sainthood, like, this is when you're so humble that you feel like God has left you. That's probably what she was experiencing. But my point is from the first year that she went out into this service of serving the poorest of the poor, she felt this all the way until her last day, until her death, right? At no point in that service did she ever feel like God was with her. But what do you think it was that fueled that service? How did she get through 50 years of serving the absolute poorest of the poor and bringing hundreds of sisters to serve the poor with her? How do you think that she managed that? without ever feeling God's presence.
Did you still have faith?
She still had faith, but from what? Where'd she get that faith from?
From that first
experience.
Yes. From that one moment, right? And she doesn't expressly say that. She doesn't explicitly say that. But I have nothing else to go on. When she's writing for 40 years about feeling that Christ is absent, that he's not with her, that God is absent, that she is not feeling his presence, that she's not seeing it, but she's still able to do that work, then we have to assume that it was from that one encounter. She had one encounter, one split second, right? And she says, I saw Christ in him. So from one split second of seeing Christ, that fueled an entire life of service in the worst possible conditions that we could ever imagine. So when I ask you, what are you looking for? When I ask you, how will you know that you have had an encounter with Christ? It has to be action. The only appropriate response to an encounter with Christ is action. There is no other response, right? And all over the Bible you see it. Jesus shows up, he sees Peter and Andrew, they're casting out their nets, he says, follow me. They're like, okay, they follow him, right? He sees other disciples, all he says, follow me. Sure, no, he doesn't even have to do anything. They just have one encounter with him, boom, they follow him. Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't even heal anybody. No miracles, nothing even happens. All he's doing is preaching at people, right? And after, what happens after the Sermon on the Mount? Multitudes follow him. And when I say follow him, it's not like everybody's just getting up and walking behind him. What does that mean, right? You have Christianity, you have Christians, right? The leper, the story of the leper, do you guys remember that story? There's multiple, but the leper comes to him and he tells him what? He says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean, right? This is after the Sermon on the Mount. He goes to him and says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And then the Lord heals him. And every time I hear that story, I think like, yeah, he was healed. But he wasn't faithful because he was healed. He calls him Lord before he ever heals him. Right? He has had an encounter with him, and from that encounter he calls him Lord. And from that encounter he now has a faith that is based in knowledge. Because unless you know the person standing before you is Christ, you're not calling him Lord. Right? So he says, Lord, if you are willing, you can heal me. And what does Christ do? He heals him, and then he goes off and he tells everybody. Right? Samaritan woman, same thing. All she does is have a chat. All they're just having a chat at the well. Jesus tells her everything about her, then she goes off and she tells everybody, and everybody believes because of her. Right? These are encounters. These are encounters with Christ. And what do they produce? Fruit. They produce fruit. They produce action. Right? The flip side of it, right? The flip side, listen, what I'm going to tell you, there was no indifference to Christ, right? People either loved him and were all about him, living their best life, or they hated him and were going to kill him. There was nobody that met Christ and was like, meh, he's good. I'd hang out with him. They were either devoted followers of him, they were either disciples and telling everybody they knew about him, or they were plotting to kill him. Right? There was nobody who was like ambivalent. There was nobody who was down the middle. There was nobody who was just like, yeah, he's a good guy. He produces, encounters with Christ produce an extreme response. And there's an author his name is Timothy Keller. He's a preacher, but he's a scholar. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with him. It's a really good book. It's called The Reason for God. And it's about finding God in the age of skepticism, whatever. Because I feel like this age is all about like intellectuals and everybody's too smart for faith, whatever. But he has a really good quote, and he says that when you're talking about Christ and you're talking about the claims that he made, he made the greatest claims in human history. This guy is coming and calling himself the Messiah. And so you only have two options when it comes to Christ, right? You either devote your entire life to him because you believe he is the Messiah, or he's a filthy liar and you should devote your entire life to taking him down. Those are the only two appropriate responses. Because the claim that he makes is so great, he can only be one of the two. He can only be the Messiah or the greatest liar that ever existed. There is no in between for him. And so our response should be as such. If I showed up and I was like, I'm the Messiah, guys. It's me. And I came to church and Abuna was like, you guys have to kiss her hand and she's going to be giving you guys communion when it's really her. And people were donating money to me. What would you think? Like, if I showed up and I said I was the Messiah, and everybody believed me, how would you feel? Nobody would have anything to say? Huh?
I said because you're speechless.
Yeah, because it's ridiculous, right? I'll tell you what, if any of y'all came and tried to tell me you were the Messiah and people were believing it, I'd be like, what is wrong with you guys? Right? I would go ballistic because that would be ridiculous, right? And this is just me. I'm not even doing miracles, I'm not doing anything, right? Because FYI, the time is going to come where that's going to happen. Someone is going to show up and they're going to claim that they're Messiah and they're going to do all kinds of miracles and there's going to be a lot of confused people. But the point is that if we have any intellectual integrity at all, then you have to have a response. And so if your response isn't going to say that he's a huge liar, then your response has to be action and it has to be fruit. Does that make sense? Does anybody disagree? You can feel free to disagree. So what does an encounter with God produce? One more time.
Action.
Action, right? It produces fruit, okay? And so what's another word for fruit and action in terms of the church? What?
Growth.
Growth, sure.
Sure.
Service, bum ba da dum. Okay, so the first thing is that you're not going to stick around in the church if you don't have an encounter with God. I mean, you're not going to stick around in the church in a meaningful way, in a fruitful way, in a way that's going to, benefit you or the people around you. You're not going, if you don't have a real connection with God, you're not going to stick around in the church. And to Mina's point, even if you do stick around in the church, if you don't have a meaningful connection with God, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? I don't care how much Hizbah you know. I don't care if you know like the Psalms inside out. You know, I don't care if you know all the church fathers. None of it matters. None of it matters. Because believe me, I know a lot of deacons who know all about the church fathers. They can tell you what Saint Manav Shemin of, Manav She'it, they know all of it. But they can't tell me about the Sermon on the Mount, right? And so I'm not interested in that. Like, I'm not interested in what other people have to say if you don't know what Christ has to say, right? You can know all it's about, you can know everything about the church. If you don't know your Bible, it's not really worth anything. And it's not going to change your heart at the end of the day. It's important, and you need to know it, but not before you know Christ. Okay? So if we don't have an encounter with God, we're not sticking around. The second thing is, if we have an encounter with God, when we have an encounter with God, you will know it because you will not be able to stay quiet. You will feel obliged. You will feel obligated to do something, and that something is service. And that's the other piece that's missing, right? Because we here in the church, we here in the Coptic church in particular, we have and all of us, myself included, we have this mentality that we just should be served forever. You know what I mean? And like everybody my age is like, there's nothing for me in the church. Like, there's just like nothing for my age group. Yeah, fool, because you're supposed to be serving someone. Like, you can't be living your whole life being served. That's just a fact, right? The way that the church works, and even Mina, when you said, oh, maybe you'll serve here, what did I say to you immediately? No. Do you know why? Because the church milks its servants for all of its worth, for all their worth. Why? Why do they do that? Because nobody is stepping up to the plate. Nobody is stepping up to the plate. And so there's 3 or 4 people who are doing it all, running rampant, and end up hating the church because they're doing everything, when all they did was have an encounter with God and they're trying to give back. Next thing you know, they hate everybody and they hate the church, okay? Because the way that service is supposed to work is, for example, when I was a freshman in college, well, I was serving in college, which was stupid, but for example, when I was a senior in college, right, I should have been serving freshmen in college as well. And then when I graduate and those freshmen become sophomores and juniors, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to be the next generation and serve the group below them. But no, nobody does that. What happens is serve me. There's nothing for my age group because your age group is not supposed to exist in the realm of service, right? I don't like giving Bible studies. I don't like talking. I don't like to do it, which should be very, very obvious. But why do I do it? Why do I do it? To serve, but why else? Because when I do this service, which is really such a disservice, but that's neither here nor there. When I do this service, when I offer up this service, this is what keeps me fed, right? Because it forces me to get deeper into my Bible. It forces me to think about things a little bit deeper. It forces me to come outside of myself. And when we're living in this state of like, serve me, feed me, it can't be. If we are not serving, we are always inside of ourselves, and then everything becomes about you. When in actuality, how much is supposed to be about me? It's not nothing, none of this is supposed to be about me. It's all supposed to be about him. But if all I'm doing is serve me, feed me, serve me, feed me, how can it ever be about anybody other than me? Right? Does that make sense? I don't feel like you guys are convinced. No, I'm convinced. So what's missing? What's the problem?
I feel like serving also like not only in the church, like you really can serve outside of the church.
Of
like,
course.
You do something to your family at home that serve, like
sure.
you do something like help some people on the street, like you do something like you not need to be in the church.
No, but it's also not, it's not either or, it's also and.
Okay, but some church doesn't have like something to do, like you said it before, but that's true. Like some church they don't have something to do. Like I keep on asking like, oh, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
You know? But
Yeah, no, for sure, absolutely. But my question, and you're 100% correct, not all services in the church. But I would venture to say that a majority of people aren't serving anywhere. And that's just me throwing out a large sum.
And it's always like, I think it's in every Catholic church, 5% of the population is serving 95% of the population.
Yeah.
There's always like 3 to 5% servants, and 95% are just warming the seats. Like, why is that? Why is there such a discrepancy? Like, why is not everybody part of something to grow the church, to grow the faithful, to grow the community? So I'm not sure why, but.
Oh, I think it goes back to not having an experience with God. I think that I think there's so many of us just going through the motions here. Everybody's showing up to church. Everybody knows their Igbeya. But at the end of the day, how many of us are spending actual time every single day in our Bible? How else are we going to know him if we don't know our Bibles? How else am I supposed to have an experience with God if I don't know what he's talking about? If I don't know who he's talking to, if I don't know what he's saying? How does that happen?
it's not gonna happen.
It's not going to happen, right? Because I'll tell you why I know this. Our church would be in a much better state. We would not have this issue of people leaving the church if everyone spent the time and committed the time to getting to know him and had that experience with him. This is not what our church would look like. Our church would not look like this. We would not have the issue of people falling away. Because I'll tell you what, when you have an experience with God, and that's not to say that there are not low times, and that's not to say that things don't get hard. Life can really suck, even when you're doing it right. That is a fact. That is a fact, and that is promise. Okay? But it's just like Mother Teresa, that one instant, it fueled her 40 years. 40 years. And don't tell me that you can have a real, true, genuine experience with Christ and just sit back and watch everybody else. I don't buy it for a second. It doesn't make sense. Because what happens when everybody in the Bible has that experience with Christ and just takes it home and it's like, that was really great, yeah, he's really great, I like him. What happens if nobody does anything? What happens if St. Paul doesn't do anything? What happens if St. Peter doesn't do anything? What happens to us if St. Mark doesn't do anything? What happens? You have an entire religion, the largest religion globally, based on 12 people's experience. 12 people's experience bred all of this, and we can't figure out how to stick around in the church, and we can't figure out how to bring people back and why they've left. 12 people. Quite literally, like, that's all it was. The disciples fueled all of this, and Jesus. He's arguably the biggest part. But they just dispersed, and they spread it all over the place, and now what do you have? 4 billion people who believe. And where do you think that comes from? I'm not asking anyone to change the world. I'm not asking anyone to change the world, although you can. We can. But all I'm asking is to take the time to cultivate a relationship. That's all. That's all it is. And this problem of people disappearing, it will not happen. It will not happen. When we have that experience, and when we take action on that experience, and when we serve others based on that experience, I don't know how people wouldn't stick around. But it feels like we're going through the motions. And I'm not just talking to you guys. Like, again, I've spent the last 20 years serving college. It's exhausting. And you're right, people don't have time. You know what I mean? People don't have energy. People have lost interest. But I would venture to say that's because they didn't know what was going on in the first place. So, I've been talking for a long time. So in closing, why do I believe that people are missing from church? I just rambled on.
What is it? One more time. The question one more time.
Why do I believe that people are missing from the church? Why people fall away from the church? What is missing? Service and? Yeah. And that's something I just want you guys to think about. Like, whether or not you've had your encounter with God, I don't know. I can't judge that. Although I can. You know, we can judge by the fruits. And like Matthew talks about, you can judge a tree by its fruits. And I don't know what your fruits are. But you can generally tell, and that's not a judgment. You know what I mean? Like, you can generally have an idea if somebody's had an encounter with Christ or not based on the fruits that they're producing. And again, that's not a judgment. But you generally have an idea. You know, if somebody ever tells you they're a Christian and you're surprised, actually I have a friend of mine who's like really good guy, and he was like, yeah, I was telling people at work I was Christian, and they're like, you are? And they were all really surprised, and he was like, I really had to rethink my life. And it's like, yeah, you really should. If people are surprised, I mean, that's something to think about, right? If people are surprised that you're a Christian, that's a concern. You can tell from your own fruits whether or not you've had an experience with Christ. And if you haven't, that is okay. This is not to shame you and say, why haven't you had your experience? That's not what this is. But it's an attempt to steer you in a direction to understand why it matters and to motivate you to get there if you haven't already. If you haven't already had an experience with Christ, whatever it is, he's not going to part the heavens, right? He's already done. He's not going to part the Red Sea. He's already done that. He's not going to do all that. But the same way that you have relationships with people, right? If you have a friend that you were really close to that you haven't seen in 10 years, and somebody says, oh, do you know so-and-so? You say, yeah, I know him, but I haven't spoken to him in forever. But you're not going to be able to say, I know anything about them. You're not privy to details of their life. They're not privy to details of your life. That's not a relationship, right? That's an acquaintance. That's someone you know of, right? And so that's all this is. It's not to shame you. But if you have not had an experience with Christ that is resulting in action, that's resulting in fruit, that's resulting in service, however large or small, you need to get on that. It's important. Because 7 out of 10 people are missing as a result. And I don't know the age group here, college or postgrad or whatever, but you know, you're bombarded with all kinds of stuff. You're bombarded with science, and you're bombarded with like logic, and you're bombarded with all this stuff that is neither here nor there when it comes to faith. And if you haven't worked it out, it's going to be a problem. And again, it's not a scare tactic, it's meant as motivation. However you take it, you take it. So an experience with God that comes through a relationship with him that produces action and produces fruit. I sincerely believe that that's the way to combat falling away from church and just understanding why people go. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time.
Does anybody have any questions? Any final thoughts? Any comments?
fallen out of the church for a while and like you bring them back. I feel like it's easier said than done. Like you don't have a relationship with God or you haven't had an encounter with God because you're not here, you're not serving, and you don't have a relationship with Him. So like, what would you say to that person to bring them back?
I wouldn't say anything to them. I mean, listen, like, I'm not really interested in bringing. You're not streaming, are you?
You would pause? This is always the best part.
No, I'm not
Speaker
gonna say
asks to
anything
pause.
profound. I'm not gonna say anything profound, but